Well, haven't gotten any comments, but I think we should get started.
Okay.
Again, I'd like to thank everybody for joining us. My name's Anne Boucher. I'm the education coordinator for the Friends of Pheasant Branch Conservancy. We're really excited to be streaming our Conservancy Day live on Facebook. This is kind of new for us. We encourage everybody who's here to consider becoming a friend of the Pheasant Branch Conservancy. The friends are the ones who sponsor this program, among other educational opportunities and restoration work in Pheasant Branch Conservancy. We have this monthly speaker series that is that we run January through November. We take December off. It's on the third Thursday of every month from 6:30 to 7:30. Our upcoming topics for the beginning of first half of next year are the Dane County Climate Action Plan. We're going to have speakers bringing that to us in January. In February, we're going to have our restoration expert discuss prairies, maybe what you can do at your own home, and the significance of them in Wisconsin. We have a kestrel box that was newly installed in the Conservancy last year. So we are going to have somebody from the Southern Wisconsin Kestrel Project come and talk to us about the importance of that box and the other ones around the state. And we have a study going on by master naturalists about the ground nesting birds that are in the northern part of the Conservancy, the Dane County portion, mostly in the grasslands there. And they've been evaluating the habitat and the number of birds that we might be finding there. And they're going to give the results of their first year of study in April. And then in May, we are going to have a talk about phenology, which is going to be a lot of fun. We have a local person who's written a book about it, and we've invited the author to join us. One more thing before we get started. Right now, the Friends are partnering with the Clean Lake Alliance and Dane County to raise enough money to install a platinum prairie in the new portion of the Conservancy that was purchased, parcel just north of the existing Conservancy, the Acre Farm. This platinum prairie will have at least 100 species of different prairie plants there. It's a really wonderful thing to do to implement because it then becomes a seed bank for other prairies on Dane County land around the area. We have a challenge going on called Seed the Need. If you're interested in donating to that challenge and helping support this effort, please go to our website and follow the links through and you'll be able to donate, and we would really appreciate that. Okay, that's the Pheasant Branch Conservancy, the Friends business, and now I'd like to turn this over to our speaker, Ryan Howell, and I'm going to let him introduce himself and get this all going. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ann. As Ann said, my name's Ryan Howell. I'm an archaeologist. Particularly, I make my living as a salvage archaeologist. I spend my days steering interstates around historic cemeteries and making sure that sewer plants don't get built on top of mound groups and things like that. But the Pheasant Branch is certainly one of my favorite areas, and so I'm happy to talk about some of the history of it. We'll be kind of blitzkrieging through 15,000 years of human occupation on the Pheasant Branch here, so I'm going to be going pretty fast. And if anyone has any questions or wants to double back on something, feel free to just comment on Facebook, and Ann will slow me down and loop me back around to give a little more detail. And then at the end, of course, we'll have time for question and answer, and I'll eventually be posting some book recommended reading and some recommended websites and things for Friends of the Pheasant Branch to look at if they're into the archaeology and the history and want to learn more about it. So with that, let's get started. Okay, so there's the title of my talk, From Mammoths to Muskets. I put 13,000 plus as we're going to talk about. We don't really know exactly when the first humans encountered the Pheasant Branch. In fact, there were probably humans here before the Pheasant Branch was here. And obviously, you could talk about the history of the Pheasant Branch all the way up to modern day. I've decided to cut it off at about 1832 at the Black Hawk War as kind of an end date. Um, every site, um, I'm an archaeologist and I'm a scientist, but really when it comes down to it, I'm a storyteller is what I am. And every site and every artifact and every landform like the Pheasant Branch has a story to tell. And it has a lot of stories to tell if you take it far enough back in time. So the Pheasant Branch, our favorite neck of the woods. To me, I'm a country guy. And so when I first moved to Middleton, I saw the Pheasant Branch. And I'm like, I'm going to live right next to that. And so I moved in on Century Avenue, County Highway M there. And then when I went to grad school, that's where I stayed. And when I came back to Madison later in 2016 to work, I moved right back into the same neighborhood. So I'd have the Pheasant Branch next to me. So obviously it's a dear part to me. For those of you that are joining that aren't familiar with where the Pheasant Branch is, it's a nature conservancy on the northwest shore of Lake Mendota. Here's the state cap. Sorry, pointing with my finger. Here's the state capitol, and this is the Pheasant Branch area up here, Middleton, Madison. And so we're going to be mainly talking about this area tonight. Again, the Pheasant Branch. Um, when most friends of the Conservancy look at the Pheasant Branch, they see a wonderful natural area, the prairies, the marshlands, the trails, the forests and things like that. When I see it, I see the history of it. And I want to take you back in time, kind of, take you on a little trip back in time. So use your imagination and kind of think of the landscape that you know so well and think of it changing as I describe how it changed over millennia. And you'll find out that the Pheasant Branch didn't always look like the Pheasant Branch. So you've had speakers out here before. I think Ann mentioned about Native American mound groups, Bob Birmingham, who's probably about the best expert we have on this subject. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about mound groups. I'll deal with them a little bit because they are Madison's kind of key archaeology feature. But I'll leave that to Bob and other experts like Bill Quackenbush and Kurt Sampson that you can invite for later talks. So again, we're back at Lake Mendota. But the Pheasant Branch hasn't always looked the way it is. This is 1935 when the Pheasant Branch was basically a giant marsh surrounded by farmland. You'll notice a lot of the same features here. This is basically where Pick and Save is nowadays. This is Allen Avenue, where what became Allen Avenue, coming down here, County Highway M, and Century Avenue. But obviously the landscape has changed quite a bit just in the last 90 years. But you go back further to 1832 and the landscape changes even more. This is the Pheasant Branch as it was naturally. A series of wetlands, creeks, and marshes before there was any kind of Euro-American development. And again, you've got the bluff where Pick and Save is. This is actually the old military road going to Fort Winnebago up in Portage. And that's actually what County Highway M and Century Avenue is on. They're in the same location. They've just been upgraded for nearly 200 years. So that gives you a point of reference. And this is the landscape that I think of when I think of the Pheasant Branch. I think of it before all the development, without the farms, without the houses. And I take it back from this period going all the way back in time. So I'd like you to kind of think of yourself in 1832. What did the Pheasant Branch look like? And can you imagine it with no farms around it, no housing, no development, just the lakes, the rivers, the creeks, and the marshes? So the first question we usually get is, what's the earliest date? We don't really know. Archaeologists believe that we know that there were humans here at least about 11 or 12,000 years ago. We call those folks Clovis, based on the town in New Mexico where they were first encountered. But even archaeologists debate amongst ourselves about is there something called pre-Clovis or not? There is a group of archaeologists that we refer to as the Clovis Mafia, who only believe that Clovis was first, and there were never people here before Clovis. But newer sites, newer information is coming out every year that seems to push back against that idea. And every year, earlier sites are found, earlier dates are found. I put it up at least 15,000 years now myself, and there's a suggestion of a lot of earlier occupations. In Wisconsin, we're not going to find many of those pre-Clovis sites because the glaciers came through and essentially scoured most of Wisconsin that to late in time. The driftless area that you all know maybe from western Wisconsin, southwest Wisconsin, was spared the scouring of the last glaciation, but it was hit by others. And so anything that is pre-Clovis in age would be buried extremely deep and would have been literally bulldozed by a glacier. We recognize the earliest people, we call them Paleo Indians, and we'll talk about them by their spear points. And that's basically all we know about them. They're so old and there were so few of them on the landscape that they didn't leave much archaeology to be looked at. But there's a counterpoint to this. There's the Native American perspective to when we're the first people here. And if you talk to Native Americans, you'll get elders and things, you'll get answers like, we've always been here. We began life here. We were created here. Indigenous archaeologists have suggested, pardon me, have suggested dates of 100,000 to 250,000 years ago. And that puts us back into Africa times in the rest of the world. So, you know, the jury's out there. And to be fair, every year those dates get pushed back farther and farther. A couple things that are interesting about Ho-Chunk oral history is that the Ho-Chunk have a story about the dells being cut, the Wisconsin dells being cut by the flood event from glacial Lake Yahara. They actually have a traditional story of watching this happen. We know that happened about 19,000 years ago based on geology. So were there Ho-Chunk here 19,000 years ago watching that happen? Possibly. There was an archaeologist and an anthropologist named Stephen Peet who was working in the 1860s. And he was interested in, at that time, the mounds were not very well understood. And he was interested in the burial mounds. And he thought he had found an elephant mound. He thought he had found a mammoth mound. And there was a thought maybe that the mounds dated back to the mammoth age, 10, 12,000 years ago. So he took a picture of an elephant around to some Ho-Chunk villages and showed it around. And the Ho-Chunk elders apparently had a word in their language that hadn't been used for a long time, but they still remembered for an elephant. And these folks had never seen an elephant. The only thing they could have seen resembling an elephant would have been a mastodon or a mammoth. And we know the last one of those died off about 10 to 11,000 years ago in Wisconsin. So did the Ho-Chunk have a story of mammoths and still have a word for mammoth in their language? Again, quite possible. So what does that paleo landscape look like on the Pheasant Branch 13,000 years ago? It looks more like northern Canada. You've got basically a giant ice wall of the glaciers receding, kind of a cold tundra environment, scrub spruce and things like that. Can you imagine this Pheasant Branch looking like that? There was an environment called the Mammoth Steppe, which was basically a cold prairie that was left behind by the retreating glaciers. And that would have been the landscape of the Pheasant Branch and the Four Lakes area before the Four Lakes ever got going, and probably before the Pheasant Branch Creek started flowing. The Pheasant Branch Creek is probably a runoff event from the glacial Lake Yahara, which would have been still mainly on ice at this time. So on that landscape, we had some pretty interesting critters running around. This is a human for scale. You had things like saber-toothed cats and cave bears. You had armadillos about the size of a small shopping cart. You had beavers that you could have used as a couch. You've got ground sloths and, of course, the mammoths and mastodons, things like that. And all of that roaming around the Pheasant Branch area. And, of course, when people think about this period, they always have the classic, Native Americans throwing rocks at a mastodon. I can assure you that no one with any kind of intelligence would ever get this close to a mammoth or mastodon. and try and make it mad, no matter how many swamps it was on. In fact, one of my old professors, George Frizen out of Wyoming, actually went to Africa and hunted elephants with stone tools with the Maasai tribe. And he found out that you could actually bring down a mammoth with a stone spear, but you had to hit it in one spot underneath the armpit. And if you didn't, you were basically just wasting your time. And so there are certainly events where humans were harvesting mammoths and mastodons. How many of those were kills? How many of those were scavenges? Up for debate. There was an archaeologist who said if someone ever killed a mammoth, they probably they did it once and they talked about it for the rest of their lives. And that's probably the case. But it was a pretty hostile environment. You had things like cave bears, again, a human for scale, walking around. If you can imagine going for a nature hike in the Pheasant Branch and running into one of these guys, that might ruin your day. You had a huge prehistoric bison that were 2 or 3 times the size of normal buffalo today, and of course you had mammoths. So a day hike in the Paleo-Indian times was not a day hike; it was a struggle for survival, and people really needed to know what they were doing. Again, we call this period the Paleo-Indian period. Archaeologists will just label periods because there's no way we can know what tribe or people we're talking about 10, 12,000 years ago. I mean, that's like asking you, where were your relatives 12,000 years ago, and can you tell us their names? It's so far back in time. They were probably, the thing to think about with this group is to think about like the Inuit in northern Alaska right now. Small groups of subarctic adopted hunter-gatherer foragers living in small bands, 20 to 50 people, probably in extended families. And there were probably at that time less than 1,000 people in all of Wisconsin. These people were very widely distributed on the landscape. And as a result, like I said, they didn't leave much archaeology. And what they did leave, mainly only stone tools. We're going to be talking about Native American hunting technology and weaponry here a little bit. So I should give you an introduction to that. Earlier in the Paleo-Indian period, you have just basic hand-thrown spears. Later, there's a development of what's called an atlatl, which is this here, which is basically a lever for throwing a spear even faster. And it basically exponentially increases the force that a spear can be thrown, actually by a factor of about 10. So it's essentially kind of a rocket spear. Then later on, about 1,000 years ago, you had the bow and arrow showing up, and then just a 22 round for scale of the various kind of points. Basically, you go from large spear points to medium-sized atlatl dart points to smaller bow and arrow points. But all of these weapons could have killed the same animal, with the exception of like mammoths and things like that. I mean, Native Americans were bringing down bison with points as small as a 22. A lot of times you'll hear collectors talk about these points as bird points, that they're only used for killing birds. That's not the case at all. Native Americans, when they hunted, had the idea that you weren't going to, you were going to have to track the animal. You weren't going to necessarily drop it within 10 feet of your deer stand and be able to drive your pickup up to it. They expected to follow the animal for a day or two. And so they were more than capable of killing an animal with a small bladed weapon like that. So again, the later part of that Paleo-Indian period, we sometimes call it the late Paleo landscape. Now we're talking 10,000 years ago. That mammoth steppe is gone. The ice glaciers are gone. And now you've got pines and other conifers moving into the Pheasant Branch area. There's an area in Richland County along the Wisconsin River called the Pine River. This is actually kind of a remnant biome of this period. It was a pine forest in the middle of the driftless area, which, as those of you who are nature fans know, is mainly oak savanna. But the Pine River was basically all white pine. And it was probably left over from this kind of climactic episode where you had pine forest in southern Wisconsin. Temperatures begin to mollify a little bit. You've still got a pretty cold climate, kind of like a North Lake Superior shoreline climate. The megafauna are now gone, but you've got extinct species of elk, moose, and bison are now dominant. And there's a whole series of these. This is a modern bison. And basically, as you go back in time, they get bigger and bigger and with much bigger horns. So you get a human for scale. So you can imagine taking on one of these would have been a serious challenge. In northern Wisconsin during this time, we see caribou hunting quite a bit. There's a caribou herd population along the Great Lakes at this time, and they're being actively hunted by Native Americans using atlatl technology. Um, in fact, we're finding some of these sites under the water in the Great Lakes because the Great Lakes levels have risen so much since this time period with glacial lake melt that some of this land, in fact, most of this landscape is actually under the water of the Great Lakes. But there are other sites on land in northern Wisconsin. Again, the idea of extinct species of bison. Those of you that have seen by the way, I'll use bison and buffalo interchangeably. At this time period, there would have been a thing called bison antiquus, basically about 2 to 3 times the size of a normal buffalo today that you might see in Yellowstone. And before that, bison latifrons, which would have been 4 to 5 times the size of a modern buffalo. How are we doing on time, man?
I have to unmute. We're doing fine. It's 6:53.
Okay.
So.
Okay, sounds good. So the next period after this is called by archaeologists the Archaic period. Populations expand. Now we have all of Wisconsin occupied. There's better what we would call archaeological visibility. IV, there's more people in the landscape. They're leaving more archaeology behind, and so we have a better understanding of this period. The climate would have been pretty similar to today. There was a period later in this period that was called the altithermal, where you essentially had almost a desert environment. So you could have had a very dry prairie environment in the Pheasant Branch for a series of a couple millennia, where essentially the Pheasant Branch would have looked like western Nebraska or western North Dakota, a very dry kind of badlands prairie environment. And areas like the Pheasant Branch that had water, like the Four Lakes that had water, would have been refuges in that kind of environment. You can imagine if you had a dry prairie, you would have needed to stay near consistent water sources. So it's a high probability that the Pheasant Branch was even more important during those times. Populations are expanding, and we start to see the first signs of kind of political status difference in Native American communities at this time. Traditionally, throughout their history, Native Americans have been what anthropologists call egalitarian, meaning that basically there are leaders and there are people who command respect, both politically and in warfare and in religious and spiritual things, but there's not coercive leadership. No one is in charge and able to force someone to do something against their will. There are signs during some periods that may have changed, but they seem to be aberrations. And the first of those occurs in the Archaic period. We have burial grounds that go from being communal burial grounds, basically where you have everyone buried the same, all in the same spot, to having one single burial with a lot of grave goods, suggesting that somebody is very important or is different from everybody else. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they were the chief, quote unquote. They could have been a powerful shaman or an individual that had a lot of respect or was considered to have a lot of spiritual power or something like that. But there's a sign that not everyone is the same during some of this period. And the archaeology shows more complex food and lifeways, and I think that's mainly because we just know more about this period. We started seeing hunting and fishing, waterfowl. A white-tailed deer is now becoming kind of the staple of hunting. People are using the river resources, the marsh resources. They're basically doing what anthropologists call mapping onto the landscape. They're learning where all the resources are in a given area, and they're learning to extract them throughout the seasons as efficiently as possible. This is a very sustainable way of life, by the way. I mean, this is something that went on for nearly, you're talking 14,000 years without ever degrading its environment. So, for those of us that are conservationists and environmentalists, we have a lesson to learn from these people. Also, pardon me. Also during this time, we get what's called the Old Copper Complex in Wisconsin. Native Americans invented metalwork here independently from anybody else. They were doing what was called hammer and anneal copper work, using the copper that sources naturally from the Lake Superior Basin, Isle Royale, the UP of Michigan. And we're making a whole variety of tools and weapons and ornaments and things. And it's a very complicated process. In fact, it's a process that was so complicated, it was completely misunderstood by archaeologists. We had no idea how these folks were doing this for the first 120 years of archaeology. And it was actually an amateur archaeologist out of Pine City, Minnesota, Joe Niebauer, who discovered this process. And he had a heck of a time convincing the archaeology academics that he had found the secret of old copper technology. But he sure had. He could replicate every form, and he could do it exactly like they did. And the test, chemical and microscopic, all proved that he was doing exactly the right way. So it's a good case of how, archaeology isn't just done by professors or people like me who do it for a living. It can be done by just people very interested in the past who are out to solve a riddle. And Joe spent 40 years of his life solving this one. And now we know. And in fact, now people are nowadays taking on copper making the traditional way as a hobby and as a kind of way to preserve an ancient skill. So if you see something in a newspaper called a copper pound, that means that people are out making copper tools the old Native American way. So we go again to the next period, 2,500 years ago, Paleo landscape. This is becoming like what our modern historic, but the pre-Europe colonization period would have looked like. The Madison of 2,500 years ago would have looked like the Madison of 1832. You would have had primarily oak, savanna, and prairie in this area, similar to the natural areas at the Pheasant Branch. The bison are now rare. There are woodland bison, but most of the bison have moved out onto the plains. Elk and deer are the dominant big fauna species. Temperatures are very similar to today. Large populations are growing. Native Americans are again expanding their populations and their presence on the landscape. And we start to see the first moves toward horticulture and agriculture. You have really focused nut harvesting. You have what's called small seed agriculture, using things like maygrass and some of the very small seed producing plants that aren't even really considered grain crops today, but if they're done in enough number can actually produce a carbohydrate harvest. Wild rice has now become a critical food group, and the Pheasant Branch would have been critical wild rice territory. Wild rice is one of the most important plants to Native Americans historically and today, and is very much a critical source of getting that carbohydrate that can store over winter and can let you survive a cold Wisconsin winter. Archaeologists call this period the woodland period. It goes from about 500 BC to about 80, 1200. Like I said, large populations are increasing as horticulture and farming develops. There's even better archaeology visibility. Now we're really seeing more sites. We can see prehistoric houses. We start to see the first signs of again, a rise of kind of social, religious inequality, and then a return to that egalitarian kind of everybody is free to do their own thing, but we work as a group kind of political structure. There's long distance political and trade networks. In Wisconsin, we're on the edge of what's called the Hopewell Interaction Spear, which is based out of the Illinois River Valley and the Ohio River Valley, all the mountain clusters down there. And it's fairly obvious that the communities in Wisconsin, even all the way up to northern Wisconsin and Lake Superior, we're communicating with those groups and trading with them actively. And Wisconsin materials were going to those people, and materials from those people were coming back up to Wisconsin. We find pots from Illinois and Ohio in sites in Wisconsin being used. This is also the first period where we start to see burial mounds being created. Pottery is developed and used for the first time. Generally, foragers who are moving around on a landscape try and keep their equipment set very light, and pottery is not a light thing. So when pottery is developed, it's a good suggestion that people are staying put in a pretty small area most of the time, enough time that it was worth making a pot, setting it up and using it for several weeks in a given spot, and then not maybe carrying it or maybe just smashing it and making a new one when you move to a new campsite. We also start to see regional variation in archaeology and artifacts across the state. Now, whether that means we're looking at the first tribes, do we have different groups that consider themselves different cultural or different political groups. We're not sure, but we can certainly see different things going on with artifacts and archaeology, say from the driftless area versus southeastern Wisconsin's drumlins and marshes, or the Lake Superior shoreline versus Green Bay, or something like that, or the central Wisconsin River Valley. Different things and different people, we think, are going on in those different regions. Pottery, obviously, like I said, is a big thing for that. And for archaeologists, pottery is very important. It's easy to tell one pot from another. They're very stylistic, and it's kind of like clothing. You can identify people by the pottery that they're making, and you can date sites by the pottery you find on them. Again, that idea that pottery suggests sedentism, the idea that you're staying in place and you're not moving around the landscape every day. You're staying in an area, say, to harvest a nut crop or to tend your field during the summer, and that you've got large communal feasting going on, that there's a reason to cook for 10, 15, 20 people. That would have been the entire group in the Paleo-Indian period. That might be the family unit in the woodland period. And of course, we get into our effigy mounds and our burial mounds in this period. Bob Birmingham, who you've had as a speaker before, as a kind of the recognized expert. For those of you who are really interested in this in the Madison area, I'd recommend this book, Spirits of the Earth, the Effigy Mound Landscape of Madison and the Four Lakes. It goes into a lot of the effigy mound groups around this area. And this is the kind of thing the Pheasant Branch would have been, a spring in the middle of a giant effigy mound group. Springs are considered sacred sites by a lot of Native American tribes, and you would have had a place like the Pheasant Branch being surrounded by effigy mounds, and that's what the archaeology tells us as well, that you had groups going around pretty much all around the Pheasant Branch. What do mounds look like today? This is a good example from the Lizard Mound State Park over in eastern Wisconsin. Kurt Sampson is the leader of a group called the Effigy Mound Initiative, and their task and their purpose in life is to protect mounds, the last few that are left. Madison was famous for its huge concentration of mounds in this area during early settlement. But unfortunately, of probably the 10,000 mounds that were around in Wisconsin during right at the time of settlement, we've probably lost all but 5 to 10% of them to plowing and other disturbance, city building, things like that. I'm getting a little background noise. Can you still hear me?
I can.
Okay.
I think you're fine. Yep.
There's generally two types of mounds. The middle woodland, BC 100 to AD, about 800, conical mounds. These are kind of the round hill-shaped mounds that you might see in Governor Nelson State Park. Most of these are individual burials. Again, that idea of treating some people special than others in kind of a crypt, and then baskets of dirt are layered on top to build up this area. And then, over a lot of these mounds then are plowed down and plowed down and plowed down. And there were a lot of reports of plow horses falling into these crypts in the 1800s once these mounds had been plowed down. You'd have a horse walking along, and then all of a sudden it would fall right into a prehistoric tomb that no one knew was there because the mound had been plowed down. These mounds, again, with these kind of single important special people, tend to have a lot of burial goods, pottery, spear points, copper, beads, rare things like obsidian from Yellowstone, shirts from Wyoming. Kind of the idea of, putting a lot of very, important or expensive things in with this burial. And then later we have, in the 800 to 1200, the effigy mound period. These groups are so large that some of them can be picked up from space on satellite. This whole bend of this river, all these little bumps and dots, are effigy mounds. This is a 2-lane highway to give you some scale of that group. That's a huge group. This is Park Street and Fish Hatchery Road, and the mound group that once was there called the Dividing Ridge Mound Group. And we're going to use that as our kind of lesson story about what happened to most of the mounds in Madison. But this just gives you an idea. I mean, every landform in Madison would have had effigy mounds this dense on it. Burials and effigy mounds, not that's one central crypt like the conicals. They're complicated. Sometimes they're in the head. Sometimes they're placed in the heart of the animal shape. Sometimes there's one. Sometimes there's more than one. Sometimes there's a lot. Sometimes there's a few. Sometimes they're laid out in what we call an extended burial, like a modern burial would be. Sometimes they're in a flex burial. Sometimes they're a bundle burial from being exposed on a scaffold or maybe carried over winter and then buried secondarily in an effigy mound. A lot of times these mounds are built and then burials are inserted into the sides of them, going up for another several hundred years. Sometimes the burials are cremations. There was a fire set and then the mound is built on top of the burned bone. So you see a lot of very different things going on with burials in the effigy mound period, and we understand very little of it. So again, an example of that mound destruction, the Dividing Ridge Mound Group along Park Street and Fitch-Hatchery Road. This is what that landscape would have looked like in 1832. You would have had essentially a hill covered with mounds running between Lake Winona and what is the other one on the other side? Lake Wingra, maybe? I don't remember my lakes well enough. But
Mendota and Monona.
Monona, but then what's not Mendota, but what's the other one just southwest of Monona?
Wingra, I think.
Yeah, Wingra. I think you're right. Yeah. Okay. So 1900, you have the first settlements, late 1800s, early 1900s, you have the first settlements of Madison, but those mounds are still intact. Unfortunately, from about 1890 to about 1950, that entire hillside was mined flat. And it's now just pancake flat and covered in houses. That entire, essentially, drumlin range was taken out for gravel and sand fill. And with it, all of those burials and all of those mounds. So when you're driving down along Park Street and Fitch-Hatchery Road, understand that you are driving basically under a burial ground instead of on a burial ground. The burials would have been 200 or 300 feet above your head in that area. So again, that idea that, there were probably 1,000 mounds in the Four Lakes area. Now we're down to probably less than 75 to 100, most of which have been looted or damaged. So about 8,900, something weird goes on in the Midwest. We have what we call the Cahokian Big Bang. And Native Americans who've been living in, pretty, sizable villages, maybe a few hundred people, suddenly get together and make themselves an empire down by St. Louis. And this is what archaeologists call the Mississippian period or the Mississippian culture. It's basically a giant town built in down in St. Louis, might have had 10 or 15,000 people living in it at its height. And they were apparently fairly interested in imposing their will on the surrounding groups. We find a lot of evidences of human sacrifice, beheading, warfare, organized warfare, where these folks are sending out several hundred warriors to take out another village, and tribute being sent down from Wisconsin to this city in the form of arrowheads and other copper and other resources. Now, is that religious tribute? Is this a religious town, kind of like a Vatican? Is it a military town, kind of like, Moscow? Is it a little both? We're not sure, but they're doing something that nobody has ever done before or ever done since in Native America. And it only goes on for about 200 years and then it's gone. So it's a real mystery, but it does leave some impact on Wisconsin. We have the Game of Thrones event in Jefferson County, Wisconsin. It appears that a group of Native Americans in Cahokia, who were probably one of the royal or leadership lineages, lost a power grab. Maybe had tried to be the dominant family and lost out, and were forced to basically flee to Wisconsin in exile. And they got here to the Crawfish River at a site called Asselin. The town's in between Madison and Milwaukee. You'll see it if you drive along I-90, 94. Sorry, 90, yeah. It's a Wisconsin state park. It's our giant, best and biggest archaeological state park. And I'd encourage you to visit it if you're ever over there. They've got excellent new signage. The group has a volunteer docent program, and you can go on tours. And generally every summer there's an archaeological dig there. But what you seem to have here is a splinter group coming out of this Cahokia Empire that lost out and has to come up to Wisconsin. And they team up with a group of local Wisconsin Native Americans from this effigy mound period, and do something kind of like a hybrid village where you've got a woodland population living in a certain area, and then you've got a leadership caste or a religious caste living in another area of the site. A lot of people think that the whole residential area is down here. I see class difference here. I see, you know, leaders and dominant groups in this wider area, and then kind of your peasant community or your worker bees in the smaller condensed area. But I have a pretty negative view about Hastelet, as people tell you. There are several interpretations. We are able to identify two different house types at Hastelet. So is this the Mississippian folks versus the woodland folks? We don't know. Or are we looking at two different groups of woodland folks that built different houses? Typically, the Mississippians tend to build squares, and the woodland folks tend to build circles. So we appear to have two different people making two different kinds of houses. We also have enough art from the Mississippian period to make a pretty good guess at what these folks look like. And whether this is their gods or special, you know, ceremonial regalia, or whether they were just really heavily tattooed, we don't know. But this is probably what a lot of those kind of leadership, warrior, priestess classes looked like in that Astalon site. Now, you got two theories on Astalon. You got the cowboys and the hippies. The cowboys believe that Astalon is basically a response to warfare and conflict. And the hippies believe it's basically a ceremonial or a ritual site. I'm a cowboy. This is a defensive structure. They fronted this against a river. They have towers sticking out of a palisade wall. This has a keyed entrance where someone has to come in along these towers and be shot at before they can get to the site. And when this site was dug, they found this northern wall, which would have been kind of the frontier of the settlement, was peppered with arrows. You don't get that at a church. You don't get that at a ceremonial site. This is a defensive fortress. And you don't invest the kind of time it takes to build a stockade that's that big, double and sometimes triple around your site for a ceremonial enclosure. That is a defensive castle, and that's what Astalon is, to my mind. It's a castle of this Mississippian woodland group. Now, who they were fighting, we don't know. But to me, this looks like a fort. And other folks will say that this is a ceremonial pathway and that these walls are not defensive at all. They're walkways and ceremonial paths that led through the site. They don't explain why there are so many defensive towers around the site, but that's one theory that you'll see on some of the signages. So while this is going on at Astalon, the effigy mound people seem to either change, disappear, or move. We're not quite sure. All three theories are still being debated. We have something that becomes known as the Oneota. This is where we're getting the formation of our modern Wisconsin tribes, our Iowas, our Ho-Chunks, our Dakotas, our Menominee, groups like that were here at historic contact. Those groups are now, and they're making what we would call Oneota artifacts right up until French contact. Pardon me for a drink here. At these sites, we've now got full-blown corn-based agriculture, what they call the Three Sisters, which is basically corn, beans, and squash. If they're planted together, they're essentially the entire, you know, kind of nutrient package, and all three plants support each other in a garden. Look that up if you're interested in gardening, the Three Sisters model of Native American gardening. Now we've got very large village populations, sometimes 1,000 to 500,000, 5,000 people clustered in certain spots on the Wisconsin landscape. Um, La Crosse is a big one. Lake Koshkonong and the Rock River is a big one, although surprisingly Madison is not. Fox River, Lake Winnebago, the Greenberry area, and there are smaller villages of this type in northern Wisconsin. Some of these villages are stockaded, again, suggesting that there's conflict and raiding going on. They are longhouse villages. Large shell-tempered pottery, thin and finely made. There's, like I said, limited evidence for raiding and extra community violence. Burial mound use now mainly disappears. Down in the Iowa River in Iowa, it continues for a little bit. And that may be the Abajase or the Iowa people continuing to still make burial mounds into a later period. Again, historically named tribes are probably separating and forming in this time period, but because everyone is using the same technology and the same artifacts, archaeology can't really distinguish between the tribes yet. They're all doing the same thing, similar life ways, with similar artifacts. These are artifacts, by the way, from the La Crosse village site. This is, I believe, I think that's up along the St. Croix River. So, typical artifacts and typical sites on an Oneota village site. Large globular pottery, very intricately decorated. The sites would have been these large longhouses in the summer. This one over here is an archaeological field school laying down in the shadow of one of these longhouses for scale to show you how many people probably lived in them. You could have probably put 50 to 100 people in each one of these longhouses. These areas had what are called ridge fields. These are the prehistoric garden fields. And what they're doing is they're mounding up the soil in ridges, and that gives you a few more frost-free days at the end of harvest for growing. It lets you kind of create a natural cold suck for the cold frosts that hit in Wisconsin early sometimes. So it's a crop insurance policy that was invented by Native Americans to protect their corn crop. Pretty ingenious system. Here you can see it in the wall of a trench that was dug at one of the sites at La Crosse. This idea of these mounded up ridges and then these valleys in between that were kind of cold pockets for frost to keep them from killing the corn. How are we doing on time, ma'am?
We are just about at 7:20. So if we want to have a few minutes for questions, you might want to.
Yep. All right, we'll have to let her go then. Moving on from this, you get into the European colonization and fur trade period. You get into the Ho-Chunk period of the Four Lakes. I want to get to one slide though. This is an early map of Madison. And one of the things that interests me when I moved into the Pheasant Branch area was the word Pheasant Branch. The pheasants aren't native to Wisconsin. How did a creek get named after pheasants? It turned out that it was named by a guy who lived in what is now Middleton, who had a town called Pheasant Branch, and he grouse hunted. He didn't know what the grouse were called, so he called them pheasants. But if you look on early Wisconsin maps, you see that the Pheasant Branch isn't called the Pheasant Branch at all. It's called Neosho Creek. That's a Ho-Chunk word. It's a Ho-Chunk word for a big bird, specifically a sandhill crane. So the Pheasant Branch didn't start life as a Pheasant Branch. It started life as the Sandhill Branch or the Sandhill Creek. And that's what it was known by the Ho-Chunk for thousands of years. So we'll go through Ho-Chunk villages in Madison. These are just the ones I could remember from memory. I couldn't get to the archives because of COVID. But it gives you some idea of the density of the Ho-Chunk occupation on the lake and in relation to the Pheasant Branch. And of the fact that the Ho-Chunk were always here. They stayed here through the 1900s. They were forced to go away. They went underground. They were hiding out in the Lake Wingra woods. And come 1832, bad things happened. But where was the main Ho-Chunk meeting on what they were going to do during the Black Hawk War? It was at the corner of Allen and Century Street at the St. Cyr Trading Post. 5,000 Ho-Chunk warriors met with the territorial governor to decide whether they were going to go to war with the United States, and elected not to. Right here in Middleton, right on the Pheasant Branch. Well, probably the most critical, decisive moment of the Black Hawk War happened less than half a mile from the Pheasant Branch. And then just the idea that, this is the landscape of Madison as I see it. The Ho-Chunk word for Madison is Dejop or Tejopara, and basically it means 4 lakes. But this is what that landscape would have looked like. Mound groups like that were in the Pheasant Branch, they're gone. But the ones that are left need to be protected. And that'll be my summary. So we'll open it up to questions and answers if anybody's interested.
I'm waiting right now to see if we get any questions. This was fascinating.
Thank you.
You. Thank you very much. We're very lucky.
Sorry if I went over time, but I could talk for about 2 or 3 days on this if no one stopped me. So.
Well, no, I think it's wonderful. It's a wealth of information, and I think it's always good for us to remember that we are living on ancestral lands.
That's right. It's a sacred landscape. It's a historic landscape, and it's a landscape that needs to be protected and preserved, not just for the environmental value, but for the cultural and historic value.
Yes, absolutely. Here's a question. What was done with the artifacts or remains in the mounds when they were destroyed?
Well, sometimes those artifacts were recovered by local archaeologists like Charlie Brown or others that were in the area, but there were only a handful of archaeologists even studying archaeology in Wisconsin when the main period of mound destruction was going on. We have records of them being basically loaded up into wagons and dumped in the lakes. The artifacts themselves were sold for pennies on the dollar to museums on the East Coast or in Europe. Some of the artifacts were collected privately. The Hamilton collection is a big collection of copper artifacts that you can see at the Wisconsin Historical Society building down on at the end of State Street on the UW campus. Good idea of the kind of collections that were being put together by wealthy people. But for the most part, people didn't care. They just destroyed the mounds and flattened them like they would tree stumps. And the bones that were there just got chewed up in the plow or tossed aside. Or there was, you got to remember, this was a very anti-Native American racist time. People were fighting Native Americans actively on the plains at this time. There was no idea that Native Americans were even human, let alone worthy of respect. They were an enemy the way that terrorists are today, or something like that. Kind of the boogeyman that frontier settlers told their children about. So you didn't have people going out of their way to honor and respect Native American ways. Now, some people did, but they were the exception. But no, not very few of those collections have survived today, and very few of them are available for study or comparison, or even to understand what was lost. We just know that we lost probably 90% of what was here.
Wow. Here's another question. And are you still sharing your screen? You might want to stop sharing.
Okay, sorry.
And here's a question. Were any migratory people in the Native American history, were there any migratory people in the Native American history of the Pheasant Branch area? So
certainly, we had groups that were kind of local resident groups, the Ho-Chunk being the main one. But after the 1750s, there was a large war between the Iroquois and the Algonquin nations of Michigan. And a lot of those Algonquin nations, like the Meskwaki, the Sauk, think of Sauk City. Sauk City was a major village for the Sauk tribe. They were originally from southern Michigan and fled to Wisconsin to avoid the Iroquois Confederacy. So you had a lot of groups moving through. You had the Kickapoo, and the Kickapoo Valley is named after them. The Sauk, the Meskwaki. The Meskwaki are called the Fox. It's where the Fox River comes from. That's where their settlements were. So you had all those groups, the Ojibwe, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa. They moved into northern Wisconsin in the late 1500s, early 1600s. So yeah, you had a lot of groups moving back and forth. And you had groups that were here, like the Iowa moving and the Oto moving out of Wisconsin too. So yeah, there was, and you got to understand that there was never an idea of kind of territories and kind of, this is Ho-Chunk County, and this is Iowa County, and this was Kickapoo County. You know, these groups were always moving across the landscape, and their ideas of political boundaries and territory were probably very different from ours.
Okay, I have a quick question and then a question that might have a longer answer. So I want to make sure we get the quick question in, which is, what was the spelling of the Native American name of the creek again? Was it Neosho? That's the question.
Yeah, the one I've seen on maps is Neosha, and that's not good Ho-Chunk. I looked it up in my Ho-Chunk dictionary, and it appears to be kind of a European kind of bastardization pronunciation of Ho-Chunk, which is what we usually see on these early maps. We see somebody who was told by a Ho-Chunk member what the name of the place was, and then just kind of phonetically spelled it out. But the best I can make of it, it's basically their word for a large bird. And then in their dictionary, it says specifically it's used to refer to a sandhill crane. So,
Great.
but you'd have to ask the Ho-Chunk Nation language department for a better clarification on that one. So,
Thanks.
but again, it kind of demonstrates that idea that, you know, the European veneer on this landscape is that thin. You know, all of these places had other names. All of these places had other stories, and they've only been kind of just painted over by European colonization.
And here's, I think, the last question that's been listed, and I think we definitely have time for it. What can you tell us about Frederick's Hill, the name of the large hill in the Conservancy that you've shown us pictures of?
Well, you know, Bob Birmingham can speak on that quite a bit more than I do. He's done all the research on that one. And I'm not going to describe what's at a Native American burial site. There are mounds on Frederick's Hill. There are mounds around Frederick's Hill. But I'm not going to go into what's there. That's something for a Native American speaker to talk about if they want to. I treat mounds with a good deal of respect and kind of spiritual awareness. And I spend a good share of my time, both professionally and on my volunteer hours, trying to protect those sites. And unfortunately, when we tend to talk too much about them and give too detailed locations for a lot of them, and talk about their shapes and where they are and which ones are, you know, where, we sometimes get looters. And so just say that there are mounds there. And I'll leave it at that. And if you want to know more about the mounds and the story of those mounds, talk to somebody like Bill Quackenbush, the tribal historian for the Ho-Chunk Nation. He'd be an excellent speaker for your next spot. So.
Wow, I'll write that down. That's a great idea. We do have one more question, and I think we have a little bit of time left. Did the Madison area have a large presence of the French fur trade, or was Madison too far south?
That's a very good question, and one that I was going to get to before I ran out of time for my slideshow. The Wisconsin River was the main corridor, so going from Green Bay to Portage to Prairie du Chien. And there is no way to get a good trade canoe off of the Wisconsin River and over the hills down to the Four Lakes area. And so what you end up having with Madison is actually a backwater of the Rock River kind of area. And so to trade with the Ho-Chunk on the Four Lakes area, you would have had to go all the way down to Rock Island, Illinois, go up the Rock River, and then go all the way up to Lake Koshkonong, where the main Ho-Chunk villages in this area were, then go up some pretty rough streams to the Four Lakes area. And as a result, the French didn't have much of an outpost here that we can tell. The British didn't have much of an outpost that we can tell. There were a few American trappers from the American Fur Trade Company that were here in the 1820s. One of them's cabin was where that big Black Hawk meeting was, the St. Cyr cabin. But most of the trading that seems to have been going on was at Lake Koshkonong. That was always the largest village for the Rock River Band. And if anybody was coming up with trade goods to trade to the Ho-Chunk, it would have been at that Lake Koshkonong area. And that's been confirmed by finds there. There's a lot of trade silver, trade beads, things like that. The Rock Island, Sauconock area, Black Hawk's village, would have also been a big trade stop. And it may have been a thing where the Ho-Chunk weren't really welcoming traders. They tended to kind of stay up in the Rock River and be on their own. In fact, some of the Indian agents said they were scared to go up there. They said it was like going into a bear's den. If you went in there and you weren't welcome, you weren't going to come out again. And so it may have been kind of intentionally designed by the Ho-Chunk as kind of a fortress, kind of a cultural bastion of their people, where they knew they were safe because it was not an area that you could get to easily. And it was certainly an area that Black Hawk tried unsuccessfully to retreat to when he was being pursued. So again, that idea that it was understood that the Rock was an area, the Rock River was an area, and the Four Lakes was an area that was hard to get to, and that was not on the beaten path. And I think that kept a lot of the kind of fur trade area sites away.
Well, great. That was a great question to end on. I can't thank you enough for being here with us. This has been fascinating. You're getting a number of
Happy to help.
comments on Facebook saying this has been wonderful, and they've really enjoyed listening to you speak and learning all of this stuff. So I want to thank everybody else for joining us to learn from Ryan. And I like the idea of getting in touch with Bill Quackenbush. So keep an eye on our website, because maybe he'll be able to speak for us sometime next fall. I'm going to end the Facebook Live thing now, but if you want to stay on with me for a minute, Ryan, that would be great. So thanks, everyone, and we'll see you the third Thursday in January for our next talk. Oh, okay, we're good.
All right.
Yay!